Have you ever looked at a person in power and wondered how they even got there? Surely you have. We've all witnessed situations where blatantly incompetent people held high positions, while truly capable ones stayed in the shadows. Just think of Emperor Nero playing the liar while Rome was burning, or more recently, business leaders like Elizabeth Holmes, who built a multi-billion-dollar empire on a technology that didn't work. Such a scenario happens so often it almost seems deliberate. What if it actually is? What if there's a twisted logic behind it? And that's precisely why power so often ends up in the hands of the least deserving. Today, we'll dive into the thoughts of one of history's most misunderstood political thinkers, Niccolò Machiavelli, and his ruthless conclusions on why stupidity and power go hand in hand. But this isn't just about old philosophy. This phenomenon actively shapes our world today, in companies, governments, even everyday life. Sometimes, intelligence and insight become obstacles to gaining influence. Understanding this paradox lets you not only see the hidden mechanisms of manipulation in society, but also learn how to carve your own path to the top. In the early 15th century, in Florence, exiled and removed from the politics he loved, Machiavelli wrote one of the most controversial works of all time, The Prince. Unlike the utopian philosophers before him, he didn't fantasize about how rulers should be in an ideal world. He was interested in how power works in practice. Everyone sees what you appear to be, but few experience who you really are, Machiavelli wrote. This idea lies at the very core of his philosophy. In the struggle for power, appearance often matters more than reality. Here lies the first clue to our paradox. Often, looking competent is far more important than actually being competent. Machiavelli noted that rulers with excessive intellect often create problems for themselves. Why? Because high intelligence usually comes with traits that harm one's struggle for power, a tendency toward nuance, adherence to ethical standards, painful self-reflection. Imagine what happens when a smart person enters a position of power. They see complexity where others see simple solutions. They acknowledge limits where others make loud promises. They doubt where others radiate confidence. And in a world that values brazen confidence and straightforwardness, these qualities become weaknesses. Take the example of Socrates, who questioned everything around him and was sentenced to death in Athens for it, and the populists who built careers on promises of simple, absolute solutions. Socrates' famous admission, "I know that I know nothing," made him a great thinker, but doomed him to political obscurity. Meanwhile, leaders who handed out easy answers have come to power for centuries. In 2017, the Journal of Management published a troubling article. The study showed that intelligence positively affects leadership effectiveness, but only up to an IQ level of about 120. After that, everything changes. Excessive intelligence begins to hinder reaching the top. Researchers suggested that extremely smart people find it hard to connect with the majority because their thinking becomes too complex for others to grasp. Think about that. Being overly intelligent can actually close the door to leadership. Whether you agree with this study or not, it forces a reconsideration of what kind of intelligence truly helps in the struggle for power. But intellectual ability alone doesn't explain everything. If intelligence sometimes holds you back, then what qualities really allow you to rise? This brings us to a psychological principle that explains why we so often follow the wrong people. Have you noticed how the loudest voice in the room easily becomes the most influential, regardless of what it actually says? This phenomenon has deep roots in our psychology. In the 19th century, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger described what is now known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias where people with low knowledge drastically overestimate their abilities, while true experts tend to doubt themselves, clearly aware of their knowledge limits. A fool thinks himself to be wise, but a wise man knows himself to be a fool. Shakespeare wrote long before science gave this phenomenon a name. Machiavelli would have immediately recognized this as one of the fundamental truths of the struggle for power. Modern research confirms this effect is especially strong in leadership contexts. In 2020, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology published a study showing that people with inflated self-esteem are perceived by others as leaders, regardless of their actual abilities. Just look at figures like George Armstrong Custer, whose unwavering confidence led to catastrophic military failures, yet did not prevent his rapid career rise and loyal support, or the tech industry, where founders speaking about their projects with absolute conviction secure billion-dollar investments, outpacing more experienced but restrained entrepreneurs. Adam Neumann of WeWork became the embodiment of this trend. Despite a shaky business model, his charisma brought the company huge investments and a devoted following. This scenario repeats worldwide. In Japan, Masayoshi and SoftBank lost $70 billion on failed investments, yet continued to attract capital, relying on personal charisma. In Russia, post-Soviet-era oligarchs gained power not through exceptional abilities, but through connections and showy confidence. Singapore, on the other hand, built an entire system to ensure confidence does not replace real competence in leader selection. In 2012, researchers from Stanford and the University of Houston reached a troubling conclusion. Narcissism, not professional qualities, turned out to be one of the strongest predictors of leadership in unstructured groups. Moreover, groups led by narcissists did not perform better. They only felt more successful. Why does this happen? Our brain tends to use simplified models to judge others. Confidence is perceived as a sign of competence, decisiveness as a sign of clear thinking. These mental shortcuts served our ancestors well in simpler times. But in today's complex world, where true competence requires acknowledging uncertainty, these illusions become traps. This confidence effect explains how incompetent people can quickly rise to the top of power. But there is an even darker mechanism that allows them to stay at the top and spread their weakness throughout the system. Machiavelli keenly observed one feature of power. Weak leaders tend to surround themselves with even weaker subordinates. In The Prince, he wrote, "The first way to judge the intelligence of a ruler is to look at those he surrounds himself with." Machiavelli understood that incompetent rulers deliberately choose people who cannot threaten them. This creates a chain reaction, and incompetence becomes built into the very structure of the organization. Dr. Tatoma Kamara-Primusic, an organizational psychology expert, describes this phenomenon as the threat of competence. Insecure leaders feel threatened by more capable colleagues, who might expose their flaws or take their place. So they prefer loyal but mediocre performers over those who could truly bring value. A kind of drought of competence spreads outward from the center of power. During the reign of Emperor Commodus in Rome, capable administrators were replaced en masse by flatterers and jesters, which accelerated the fall of the great empire. In modern Brazil, would you like me to continue paraphrasing? The transition will be to the example about Brazil. And in the political system of St. Roma, this mechanism was institutionalized. Incompetent officials held high posts, not due to merit, but personal connections. A similar picture was observed in African countries. For example, Zimbabwe under late Robert Mugabe, where professional managers were consistently replaced by party loyalists, dealing a catastrophic blow to the economy. This leads to what organizational psychologists call homophily, the tendency of people to surround themselves with those similar to themselves. Those in power create islands of incompetence around themselves, closed off to alternative opinions and constructive criticism. Think, have you ever worked in an organization where asking questions was seen as disloyalty, and discussing problems was considered a breach of team spirit? This is exactly the manifestation of that network of mediocrity spreading around a weak leader. And even knowing about these mechanisms, we still repeatedly tend to choose leaders who promise simple solutions. This vulnerability explains why incompetence continues to thrive, despite our best intentions. Why do we keep trusting those who offer oversimplified answers to complex questions? The answer lies deep within cognitive psychology, in our fundamental need to find certainty in an uncertain world. True experts always acknowledge the complexity of reality. They see the limits of their knowledge. They account for contradictions and trade-offs. But these intellectual virtues rarely bring us psychological satisfaction. Most people settle for the appearance of truth, mistaking it for the real thing. As Machiavelli wrote, accurately capturing the essence of human nature. We need the feeling of certainty, even if it is illusory. Think about what happens during a crisis. The public rarely rallies behind a leader who admits the situation is complex, requiring careful analysis and difficult decisions. Instead, people follow the one who confidently declares, "I alone can fix it." Simplicity and decisiveness turn out to be more appealing than honesty wrapped in complexity. Compare how climate change is discussed. Scientists speak in cautious forecasts, with caveats, ranges of possible outcomes, and intricate policy recommendations. Public figures, on the other hand, present the same topic through short, categorical slogans filled with absolute certainty. Scientific honesty doesn't compete well with the psychological comfort of simple stories. Or take the healthcare debate. Doctors speak of the inevitable trade-offs in any system. Politicians promise universal solutions without downsides. Who wins public support? Naturally, the one who speaks simply and with confidence, regardless of the truth. One particularly troubling experiment was conducted in 2017 by researchers at Yale. Participants were given complex math problems tied to political topics. Their ability to interpret the data correctly directly depended on whether the outcome aligned with their political beliefs. And most strikingly, the most intelligent participants showed the greatest bias, using their intellect not to seek the truth, but to justify the conclusion they wanted. Psychologists call this the need for cognitive closure, an intense desire for clear and simple answers instead of uncertainty. When people face threats or feel uncertain, their craving for simplicity skyrockets. They become more prone to black and white thinking, and more susceptible to authoritarian leaders who radiate absolute confidence. It is in these moments that the most dangerous dynamic emerges. The more complex and unsettling the world becomes, the stronger our pull toward simplistic solutions, and the more vulnerable we become to those offering easy answers. It's like a glitch. Ask yourself this: have you ever been especially drawn to an explanation simply because it was clear and decisive, even though, deep down, you suspected reality was far messier? That's how this psychological mechanism shows up in our own minds. Yet this craving for simplicity explains only part of the phenomenon. There is a darker dimension, one that reveals why intelligence alone is not enough to resist manipulative power. And this is where Machiavelli becomes truly disturbing. He argued that moral considerations often stand in the way of intelligent people in the struggle for power. One of his most famous statements reads, "A prince who wishes to preserve his position must learn how not to be good, and use this knowledge as necessity requires." Intelligent people are generally inclined toward more complex moral reasoning, and this may hinder them from competing with those who are not bound by such constraints. In any competitive environment, the one willing to cross moral boundaries gains access to strategies that remain unavailable to ethically restricted opponents. He may make promises without intending to keep them, use deceit and treachery to discredit rivals, and inflame fears and prejudices that others would consider unacceptable. Look at the fates of Cicero and Julius Caesar in ancient Rome. Cicero, a brilliant orator and principled politician, ultimately lost the power struggle to Caesar, who crossed the Rubicon without hesitation, both literally and metaphorically, violating laws and norms his opponents considered sacred. Even today, we often see ethical candidates lose to opponents unafraid to lie and defame. A study from the University of British Columbia found that psychopathic traits, such as a lack of empathy combined with social charm, contribute to rapid career advancement. This pattern shows up across cultures, from the image of the ruthless businesswoman Xin Yu in China to the corporate world of Scandinavia, where even in societies officially valuing cooperation, manipulative leaders often surpass their more ethical peers. This creates what game theorists call a race to the bottom. When dishonest tactics succeed, others feel pressure to either adopt those same methods or be pushed aside. Over time, entire systems are reshaped, turning amorality from an exception into the norm. Becoming aware of these grim patterns can lead to a sense of hopelessness. but not all environments reward incompetence and immorality equally. By understanding the conditions under which foolishness and power thrive, we can learn to design systems where success is based on actual competence. Machiavelli understood clearly, different conditions reward different traits. Some environments naturally select for the best, while others create fertile ground for the growth of mediocrity. So what determines which of these two paths prevails? Above all, feedback mechanisms and accountability structures. In fields where the consequences of decisions are immediate and undeniable, incompetence is quickly revealed. Think of a surgeon whose patients die, or an engineer whose bridges collapse. Such professions naturally select for competence, because the cost of failure is obvious and high. But in environments where feedback is delayed, vague, or easily manipulated, incompetence can flourish for years. Political systems, where failure can be blamed on predecessors or external forces. Corporate structures, where losses are masked by accounting tricks. The media space, where being attention-grabbing matters more than being truthful. All of these are fertile ground for the rise of mediocrity. Second, the design of institutions and the distribution of power. When power is centralized without oversight, costs, or counterweights, incompetence thrives. The collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, accelerated precisely because decision-making was concentrated in the hands of a few and stripped of real accountability. Germany, by contrast, built a corporate governance system with a dual board structure, separating management and control. This creates an institutional barrier that makes it harder for incompetent leaders to rise. Third, information asymmetry and complexity. When success is easily measured and outcomes are transparent, competence tends to win. But when goals are vague and results are subjectively judged, style often defeats substance. People judge more with their eyes than with their hands, because everyone can see, but only a few can truly know, wrote Machiavelli. He was right. Most people judge superficially, especially in complex areas where few can assess competence. Fourth, the structure of economic incentives. Systems that reward short-term wins over long-term results naturally promote leaders with surface-level charisma. The 2008 financial crisis showed this clearly. Bonuses for quick profits, without regard for real risk, created an entire class of such executives. Now think about your own life. What factors in your environment reward genuine competence? And which ones allow mediocrity to flourish without consequence? Recognizing these structural forces helps not only to navigate them, but to detect when systems become vulnerable to manipulation. Yet even in well-structured systems, incompetent leaders can hold on to power. They do so intentionally, through specific psychological tactics Machiavelli would have recognized instantly. The first tactic, exploiting tribalism and identity politics, by drawing sharp lines between us and them. Such leaders turn every substantive accusation into an attack by enemies. This shields them from criticism and deepens their supporters' emotional attachment. Psychologists call this identity fusion. When the leader's persona fuses with the group's identity, any attack on them feels personal. Think of cult figures like Jim Jones, or authoritarian rulers who used the us versus them tactic. In Malaysia, former Prime Minister Najib Razak clung to power despite massive corruption scandals, by stoking ethnic divisions. Brazil's polarization under Bolsonaro is another striking example, where tribal loyalty triumphed over facts. The second tactic, cognitive overload. A constant stream of scandals, crises, and breaking drama floods us with so much noise, we simply don't have the mental bandwidth left to analyze or resist. When we're endlessly distracted by the next urgent story, we lose focus on what matters most. The third tactic, manipulating truth through doublethink, a term coined by George Orwell. Constant position shifts, rewriting history, they create a fog where truth dissolves and accountability vanishes. The crowd is always captivated by appearances, and the world is mostly crowd, Machiavelli observed. This is not contempt, but a recognition of our shared vulnerability. Our minds evolved for a simpler world, not for the chaos of modern information warfare. The fourth tactic, exploiting economic instability. When people feel materially insecure or fear for the future, they become more receptive to leaders offering simple answers to complex systemic problems. In many post-industrial regions, economic anxiety became perfect ground for populists, those promising easy exits through scapegoating instead of honest analysis. Now think about your own news habits. How often do you find yourself chasing the next scandal, instead of digging into the deeper and more important patterns? That, too, is the mechanism at work. Awareness of these dark patterns is necessary, but not sufficient. To truly protect yourself and your community, concrete strategies are needed. At the individual level, mindfulness is our first line of defense. By understanding the hidden forces shaping our thinking, we become less vulnerable to them. This defense relies on three key practices. First, developing intellectual humility, the ability to acknowledge the limits of one's knowledge. Research shows that people with high intellectual humility evaluate ideas based on content rather than confidence in delivery. Intellectual humility works like a cognitive immune system, protecting us from manipulation and false certainty, just as physical immunity protects against infections. Second, cultivating media literacy, the skill to distinguish depth from spectacle. This means consciously choosing sources, questioning how information is presented, and filtering for quality rather than chasing quantity. Warren Buffett once said, "Indeed, successful people say no to almost everything. Wise thinkers reject most information noise to focus on clarity and deep understanding." Third, embracing philosophical reflection, the habit of regularly stepping beyond everyday bustle to contemplate fundamental principles. The ancient Stoics recommended daily reflection as a way to guard against emotional impulsiveness. As Bacon wrote, "A wise man creates more opportunities than he finds." Reflection makes us active creators of our mental world, not just passive consumers. At the collective level, institutional design is decisive. Systems can be organized to reduce the influence of bias, deception, and incompetence. Here, structures capable of providing honest feedback regardless of a leader's charisma or persuasiveness are crucial. Compare a company with an independent board of directors to one where the board is just a formal rubber stamp. The Boeing 737 MAX crisis showed what happens when engineers' warnings are ignored in favor of profit. Lack of accountability turned into tragedy. Second, fostering cognitive diversity, including different perspectives in decision-making processes. Diverse teams are not just a social ideal. Empirically, they make more accurate decisions, uncover hidden risks, and reduce blind spots that homogeneous groups often miss. Third, ensuring transparency, rules that prevent complexity from becoming a cover for incompetence. Laws on government transparency, requirements to disclose conflicts of interest in medicine. All these complicate hiding problems behind technical jargon or bureaucratic complexity. Ask yourself which of these protections exist in your community and which are missing. If we rebuilt our systems based on competence, humility, and truth, what kind of world could we create? As we approach the end of the study, we return to the man who inspired our journey. What would Machiavelli say about our modern situation? Machiavelli was misunderstood for centuries. He did not advocate the dark strategies he described. He merely exposed them. He sought to understand how power actually works, not how we wish it would. He believed we could create better governance systems. People do not honor titles. Titles honor people. This profound observation reminds us that power itself does not deserve unconditional respect. Power must be earned through worthy use, regardless of who wields it. The intersection of Machiavellian political philosophy and modern psychology reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and social systems, but it is precisely these uncomfortable truths that we need if we hope to build a better future. The way forward is not to pretend these dynamics don't exist. It is to understand them deeply enough. To overcome them, we must design systems that account for human vulnerabilities instead of exploiting them. We need to develop personal practices that strengthen our resilience to manipulation. And most importantly, we must realize that while stupidity sometimes gains power, intelligence combined with moral courage remains our best hope to build societies where merit truly matters. What dynamics have you noticed in your communities? Have you seen these patterns come to life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this study valuable, consider subscribing and sharing it with others who could benefit from these insights. Until next time, remember, understanding darkness does not mean submitting to it. It means gaining the power to create light. Thank you for watching. See you soon.